Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down powerful ideas into clear, actionable insights. Today, we are diving into a framework that, and I'm not exaggerating here, promises to give you a genuine business superpower. That quote comes from the best-selling author and business expert Josh Kaufman. And his whole argument is that whether you want to start a company from scratch, get that next big promotion, or even just make sense of the world around you, understanding a few core business principles is the absolute key. It's like having a special lens to see how the world really works.
Now, for a lot of people, when you hear the words business education, your mind probably jumps to one place: a Master of Business Administration, right? An MBA. There's this huge assumption out there that to really get business, you have to go through a formal, prestigious, academic program.
But that path, well, it comes with a pretty staggering price tag. We're talking about $250,000 for a 2-year program at one of the top schools. And that's often paid for with debt that can follow you around for years, maybe even decades, no matter how things turn out. Kaufman's big argument is that for most people, this is a huge mistake.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Our first section tackles what we're calling the $250,000 question. Is that $250,000 degree the only way to succeed in business? Or is there a more direct, a more efficient, and let's be honest, a much more affordable path to truly mastering the fundamentals? So let's look at the two paths side by side. On the left, you've got the traditional MBA. And what Kaufman points out is really fascinating. About 2/3 of graduates from these elite programs get funneled into one of two very specific careers: management consulting or investment banking. So in many ways, it's an incredibly expensive, 2-year-long interview for a very particular kind of job. On the right, you have his personal MBA approach, which is all about skipping the institution and focusing on learning the universal principles, the core concepts that apply to any business, anywhere in the world, at any time. All right, now let's get to the heart of Kaufman's framework. This brings us to section 2, and it's a beautifully simple idea. Every business can be broken down into 5 parts. You know, what's really important to grasp here is the difference between complicated and complex. Business isn't necessarily complicated, like some unsolvable riddle. No, it's complex. It has a lot of moving parts. But once you see how those parts fit together, it all starts to make sense.
And here they are, the 5 essential parts of any business, big or small. First, there's value creation. That's figuring out what people need or want, and then, well, making it for them. Second, marketing. You've got to get the attention of the right people. Third, sales. That's the process of turning curious prospects into happy, paying customers. Fourth, value delivery. This is all about giving your customers what you promised and making sure they have a great experience. And finally, number 5, finance. You have to make sure you bring in more money than you spend. That's it. Every single business you can think of is just a process built on these 5 parts. And if any one of these is weak or broken, the whole system just falls apart.
So now we're going to zoom in on that very first part because it's the absolute foundation of everything. This is section 3, solving problems people will pay for. This is all about value creation. And it's so much more than just having a cool idea for a product. It's about finding a problem, an annoyance, a point of friction out there in the world, and then creating a real solution for it.
You know, the secret here is shockingly simple. You just have to pay attention. The world is not and will never be running out of problems to solve. Seriously, the next great business idea could be hiding in plain sight in a frustration you deal with every single day. The very first step is just to open your eyes and start noticing those moments where you think to yourself, "Oh, there has to be a better way to do this."
But how do you find those real, deep, unmet needs? People aren't always great at telling you what they want. Kaufman shares this brilliant story from his time working at Procter & Gamble. Researchers were studying how people use powdered laundry detergent. Now, if they had just sent out a survey asking people about it, they would have gotten one set of answers. But by actually observing what people did in their homes, they uncovered something absolutely incredible.
So, a researcher noticed a woman who would wait for the entire washing machine tub to fill up with water before she would add the powdered soap. Why? She wanted to be absolutely sure that it dissolved properly. Now, the chemists at P&G knew it dissolved just fine, but that was irrelevant. The customer had a psychological need for reassurance. And that one single observation, that insight into an emotional need, not a technical one, led to the creation of liquid laundry detergent, a multi-billion-dollar product category born from a feeling.
Okay, so let's say you've observed a problem and you have a potential solution. You tell your friends about it, you tell your mom, and they all say, "Oh, that's brilliant. I would totally buy one." As anyone who's ever pitched an idea knows, that kind of feedback is completely and utterly worthless. You need a real signal, not just polite encouragement.
So what's the real test?
This is the moment of truth. The ultimate form of validation isn't someone saying, oh, what a great idea, I want one. The real acid test question is this. Is this problem so annoying for you that you are willing to pull out your wallet and pay me right now to make it go away? Like it says here, a swiped credit card is the only proof that matters. That's the only true signal that you've created genuine value. It is the difference between asking for an opinion and asking for a pre-order.
So once you've created something of real value, the framework shows us the next steps are marketing and sales, getting attention, and then turning that attention into paying customers. So for this next section, we're going to focus on the psychology behind that. Once you have something people will actually pay for, you need to get them to notice it and then convince them to buy. And as we're about to see, this is all about understanding what makes us tick as humans.
Kaufman breaks down human motivation into 5 core drives. First, the drive to acquire things, status, and power. The drive to bond with others, to feel loved and valued. The drive to learn and satisfy our curiosity. The drive to defend ourselves, our loved ones, and our property. And finally, the drive to feel, to experience new emotions and sensations. The simple rule is, the more of these drives your offer connects with, the more powerful and compelling it's going to be. And this leads us to a classic, and I mean classic marketing mistake. So many businesses try to sell you on the features, the logical, technical specs. They'll tell you their new MP3 player has a 1 GB hard drive. Okay, that's a feature. But remember those core human drives? They're all about emotion. And people don't buy features, they buy benefits. They buy the emotional outcome. Apple understood this perfectly with the original iPod. They didn't sell the feature, they sold the benefit, the feeling of joy and freedom, 1,000 songs in your pocket. One speaks to your logical brain, the other speaks directly to your core drives, to your heart and your imagination.
Okay, so we've covered creating value, marketing, and sales. But maybe you're looking at that 5-part framework and thinking, this all sounds great, but I don't know the first thing about finance, or I'm just terrible at marketing. This brings us to our final section, and it tackles that exact problem. How can you learn anything fast? How do you actually acquire the skills you need to execute on this business framework without, going back to school and spending another $250,000?
I'm sure we've all been intimidated by the famous 10,000-hour rule, this idea that it takes a solid decade of nonstop practice to become an expert. What Kaufman clarifies is that this rule really only applies to achieving elite, world-class mastery in a super competitive field, like becoming a chess grandmaster or a concert violinist. For most things in business and in life, our goal isn't to be the best on the planet. It's just to be good enough to get the job done effectively.
And how long does that take? Well, the answer is kind of shocking. Kaufman's research suggests that for most new skills, it only takes about 20 hours of focused, deliberate practice to go from knowing absolutely nothing to being surprisingly competent. Think about that for a second. That's just 40 minutes a day for about a month. That's it.
And there's a specific method to it. First, you deconstruct the skill. You break it down into the smallest possible component parts. Second, you learn just enough theory so that you can start practicing and notice when you're making a mistake. The key is not to get stuck in research mode forever. Third, you have to remove any barriers to practice. Make it as easy as humanly possible to get started. And finally, and this is the most important part, you pre-commit to practicing for at least those 20 hours. That commitment is what will power you through that initial wall of frustration where most people give up.
This quote from the systems theorist John Gall just perfectly ties everything we've talked about together. You don't start out by trying to build a massive, complex, multinational corporation. No, you start with a simple system that works. You create value for one person. You make one sale, you deliver that value, and you make sure the money works out. You start simple with each of those 5 parts, prove it works on a tiny scale, and only then do you build complexity from there. It applies to building a business, and it applies to learning a new skill.
So, we want to end with a question for you to think about. We all live with these little daily frustrations, these annoyances that we just accept as the way things are. But an entrepreneur, someone with this business superpower, sees those frustrations not as permanent problems, but as opportunities in disguise. So now that you have this framework, the only real question left is, which of those problems out there will you be the one to solve?